She walked into the sheriff's station looking for her son, tired, gentle, and confused. A white deputy saw a frail old black woman and decided to humiliate her, not knowing who she really was. He poured water on her head in front of everyone, thinking he'd get away with it. But what he didn't know, she was the mother of the one man who could end his career, the new sheriff. What happened next shook the entire department and forced an entire town to face what it had ignored for years. This isn't just a story about one bad cop. It's about what happens when justice finally has a name and a face. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. It started like any ordinary morning in Ridgepoint. The sun had barely pushed through the clouds when Evelyn Carter stepped out of her front door alone. The street was quiet, mailboxes still unopened, porch swings unmoved. The air was thick with southern humidity, and everything smelled like dew and silent. Evelyn walked out wearing her lavender Sunday dress, the one her late husband used to say made her look like hope itself. No one saw her leave, but that didn't matter. Evelyn wasn't looking for anyone else. Her thoughts were clear, or at least as clear as they could be on a day like this. She clutched her purse like it contained something sacred, and maybe to her it did, because the only thing she knew for sure was that her son, Malcolm, needed her. She didn't know exactly what kind of danger he was in. She couldn't say what brought that feeling on, but deep in her chest, something pulsed with urgency. That old, familiar instinct only mothers understand. Her son was in trouble, and she had to find him. Now, inside the house, Nurse Yvonne Tran was only gone for 5 minutes. A quick call on the back patio. Her sister had been in a minor car accident and needed help with the insurance. Nothing serious, just a bump, a scrape. Yvonne figured Evelyn would stay in the kitchen, maybe humming along to gospel radio or sorting her photo albums like she always did. But when she came back in and saw the front door cracked open, her heart dropped. By then, Evelyn was already gone, already several blocks down Magnolia Avenue. Her slippers made soft sounds on the sidewalk, but her determination was loud in her heart. Her mind may have betrayed her many times before, but today her mission was alive and sharp. She remembered the Ridgepoint Sheriff's Office, or at least the one that existed back when she still drove herself to town. It was a red brick building with worn steps and a heavy door. She thought Malcolm still worked there, and even if she wasn't sure where she was heading, she walked like she knew. And when her legs tired, she stopped. When a stranger looked concerned, she smiled and said, "My boy works for the law. I'm going to see him." Most people just nodded and moved on. People in Ridgepoint had learned to ignore what made them uncomfortable. By the time Evelyn reached the station, the sun had started to bite at her back. Her dress was damp from the walk, her curls a little frizzed from the heat, but her eyes were alive, tired, yes, but shining with a mother's kind of courage. She took a moment at the base of the station steps. She looked up at the glass doors and muttered to herself, "He's in there. He's me. I'm coming, baby." Inside, it was another world. Cold lights, white noise, the smell of stale coffee and floor wax. People sat along the walls, some with speeding tickets, others waiting on bad news. And behind the tall counter sat Deputy Brian Cargill, flipping through messages on his phone, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Evelyn stepped inside like she was entering holy ground. This was where her son worked, where he protected people, and she was proud of him, always had been. She approached the desk slowly. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "Excuse me, sir?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cargill didn't look up. She tried again. "Sir, I'm here to see Malcolm. Malcolm Carter. He's my son." That got his attention. He glanced up, took in the sight of her black, elderly, worn shoes, a church dress 2 decades old, and frowned. "Your son works here?" "Yes," she replied with a soft smile. "He's here." "He is?" Cargill stared at her like she was a broken machine. "Lady, you got the wrong place." "No, sir. This is the sheriff's office. He's here. Please, just call him for me." He chuckled under his breath, but there was no humor in it. "You can't just come in here like this. You think we're some kind of visitor center? Evelyn blinked. I'm not trying to cause trouble. Then leave, he snapped. Her smile faltered. I can wait right here if that's all right. It's not, he said, rising from his chair. A few people in the waiting room turned to watch. Evelyn's hands clutched her purse tighter. Please, I just want to see him. He's my baby, Cargill scoffed. Ain't no Malcolm Carter here, ma'am. He's the sheriff, she said quietly. That made him pause, just for a second. And then he laughed. Oh, you think the sheriff is your son? That's rich. Evelyn didn't respond. She just looked past him, toward the hallway behind the desk. That hallway led somewhere. Maybe to Malcolm. She took a step toward it. Cargill's face turned red. Hey, he barked. I said stay back. But Evelyn didn't stop, and that momentar tiny, quiet defiance was the spark. The beginning of something that would shake this building to its core, something that would rattle not just the lives inside it, but the image this town had painted of itself for generations. It wasn't just about one cop and one woman. It was about what happens when someone raised on dignity meets a man clinging to power. When a mother's love walks right into the heart of everything broken, the next 5 minutes would change everything, and none of them saw it coming, not even her son. The silence in the lobby didn't last long. It never does. Moments like this, they hum beneath the surface, waiting to explode. And when they do, it's never clean, never quiet. It's a mess of confusion, power, and the fragile threads that hold people together. Deputy Brian Cargill stood frozen for a second, his hand twitching just slightly at his side. He was still behind the reception counter, but his posture had shifted, shoulders squared, chin lifted, eyes narrowed. Across from him, Evelyn Carter hovered near the entrance to the hallway that led deeper into the sheriff's office. It wasn't marked employees only, but it didn't have to be. The message was clear. This was where uniforms belonged, not old ladies. In his mind, she was trespassing, not just physically but morally. She'd crossed an invisible line. And that, to a man like Cargill, was a challenge. He didn't like challenges. He liked control. He raised his voice again, louder this time. Ma'am, I'm not going to say it again. Turn around, right now, or I will call in backup. Evelyn didn't move. Not out of defiance, but because she couldn't. Her hand paused mid-air, reaching instinctively for the wall. Her face shifted, confusion creeping in like a fog. She wasn't sure anymore if she was standing in the right place. Her breath came in soft, shallow gasps. Her eyes darted, looking not for escape, but for familiarity. For her son. He'd said something once, months ago. If anything happens, Mama, come find me. You come straight to the station. And she had. She was doing what he asked. Why was it going so wrong? But the voice that met her now wasn't Malcolm's. It was Cargill's. Fast and angry, and coming right at her. In 3 long strides, he was out from behind the counter knot, through the side gate, like a trained officer, butt over it, like a man in pursuit. He vaulted it with an ugly kind of energy, like he'd been waiting for an excuse to get physical. A gasp escaped from the row of chairs along the wall. People shifted. No one moved to intervene. Not yet. Cargill's boots thundered against the linoleum as he stomped toward her. Lady, don't make me put hands on you, he barked. Evelyn spun around, startled. Please, I'm just trying to find my son. I don't give a damn who you're trying to find, he exploded. His voice echoed off the walls. You don't go where you're not allowed. You don't just walk into a sheriff's office like you own the place. A woman sitting near the exit pulled her toddler closer, shielding his ears with her hand. An elderly man in a tan veteran's cap leaned forward on his cane, visibly tense. You could feel the electricity in the room, the tension between what people knew was right and the fear of stepping forward. Evelyn shrank into herself, not because she was weak, but because she was old and tired, and simply not used to being yelled at like this. She'd raised her son on respect. She used to teach Sunday school. She used to bake pies for the neighborhood. And now she stood here lost in a place that should have brought her safety, being treated like trash. Her voice quivered. I didn't mean to upset you. You're not listening, he snapped. You people never listen. Those 2 words. You people. He said them like they tasted bad in his mouth, like they burned going down, and everyone in the room heard them, felt them, and knew what they meant. But Cargill wasn't finished. He turned abruptly and snatched something off the intake desk. A half-full plastic bottle of water. Clear, cold, forgotten by whoever last sat there. His fingers tightened around it. Evelyn watched him. Something in her still didn't believe it, not really. Not in 2025. Not here. Not from someone who wore the same badge her son wore with pride. He twisted the cap slowly, methodically. The sound click, crackle, was small. But somehow, it was deafening. Then without a word, he stepped forward and dumped it over her head. The water poured with no warning. It drenched her white curls, flattened them against her scalp, and ran in little rivers down her cheeks. It soaked into her lavender dress, turning the lilac petals on the fabric into dark blotches. She didn't move. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, her arms slightly out, her eyes wide. The whole room watched in stunned horror. Cargill let the bottle fall to the floor. It bounced twice and rolled into a puddle. "There," he muttered. "Maybe now you'll learn." No one spoke, no one dared, except for a little girl who whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "Why'd he do that to Grandma?" Evelyn brought her hand to her mouth knot to wipe away the water, but because she felt something rise in her chest, not anger, not fear, but heartbreak, deep, ancestral heartbreak, the kind you inherit, the kind you thought the world had left behind. A moment later, the veteran with the cane stood up. Slowly, quietly, he walked over and offered her his handkerchief, a blue one, monogrammed. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you didn't deserve that." Cargill snarled. "Sit your butt down, old man." The veteran turned to him, unflinching. "You're gonna regret this," he said calmly. "Not just because it's wrong, but because you don't even know who you just laid hands on." And then came the sound that would change everything. Boots, heavy, purposeful. The back hallway door creaked open, and a voice, low and clear, broke through the tension like thunder on a hot night. "Mom?" Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, was Sheriff Malcolm Carter. His presence filled the lobby without needing to say more. He took one look at the scene, his mother dripping, trembling, humiliated, and his breath caught. Not just in shock, but in disbelief that this was happening in the very building he commanded. The place he promised would be safer under his leadership. He stepped forward. "Who?" he said slowly, each word measured like a blade. "Did this to my mother?" Cargill's face went pale, like the blood had been vacuumed from his body. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The room didn't breathe. Even the buzzing lights overhead seemed to fade into silence. And that was the moment. The moment Ridgepoint sins caught up with it, and the man who held the badge realized he had just ended his own career with a single, cruel mistake. The weight of silence that fell over the Ridgepoint Sheriff's lobby felt like the tomb of something sacred had just been sealed. No one moved. Not the people in the chairs. Not the officers behind glass windows. Not even the woman standing in a puddle, soaked to the skin, heart unraveling right there in the middle of the room. Sheriff Malcolm Carter stood in the doorway, motionless. His posture was calm, military straight, but his eyes, they betrayed him. They weren't the eyes of a commanding officer at that moment. They were the eyes of a son staring at his mother, humiliated, mistreated, standing where she never should have been alone. He stepped forward. Each footfall landed like thunder in a courtroom. 1, 2, 3. The room didn't just hear them, it felt them. It was the kind of walk that didn't need shouting, that didn't need explanation. You could feel the reckoning building with every slow, heavy step. Deputy Brian Cargill shifted where he stood, tried to square his shoulders. His badge gleamed on his chest, but suddenly it felt like it was weighing him down. He tried to find words, some excuse, some way out, but his mouth was as dry as sandpaper. "Sheriff, he started, but the words crumbled in his mouth. Malcolm didn't answer. Not yet. He didn't even look at him. He walked right past the man, past the officers peeking through office windows. He went straight to Evelyn. She looked up at high eyes, watery, but not from the water, from the ache, from the confusion, from the heartbreak of standing in a place that was supposed to be his sanctuary, and instead finding cruelty. "Baby?" she whispered, her voice paper-thin. He didn't speak, just reached up, unfastened his duty jacket, and draped it over her shoulders, gently, carefully, like she might break if he touched her too hard. She leaned into him, folded her arms around his waist, like she'd done when he was a boy and had skinned his knee. Only now, the roles had reversed. The child had become the protector. "I came to find you," she said into his chest. "I thought something had happened to you." He looked down at her for a moment, then slowly turned his eyes up toward the man who had done this. His voice was low, controlled, but you could feel the ice underneath it. "Who poured water on my mother?" The entire room froze. Even the buzzing light seemed to dim. Cargill swallowed hard. "She was. She entered a restricted area. I tried to redirect her. She was disoriented. Wouldn't listen." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "So you poured water on her?" "Too. Didn't mean it like that, sir. I was trying to de-escalate." "You poured water," Malcolm said again, louder now, each word slicing through the room, "on an elderly woman who came asking for help. In front of the community, in front of my staff, in this building." Cargill's face twitched. "Sheriff, I didn't know it was your mother." Malcolm stepped forward. "That's exactly the problem." He took a breath, steady, but his jaw was tight. "You didn't know, so you assumed she didn't matter." "She was disrupting operations, sir. She walked into the back hallway. I told her to stop. And when she didn't, your response was to assault her with water. I was under stress." Malcolm shook his head, calm but sharp. "We all work under stress, Deputy. Stress doesn't give you the right to treat someone like they're less than human. I was trying to regain control of the situation. By humiliating an old woman?" Cargill looked away. Malcolm turned slightly, pointing to his mother, who was now seated, gently patting her face dry with a towel brought by another deputy. "Look at her." Cargill hesitated. "I said look at her." Slowly, Cargill lifted his eyes. Evelyn didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. The way she held herself, shoulders hunched, hands trembling, said everything. "Tell me," Malcolm said, "that what you did was okay." Cargill's mouth opened, then closed. "I can't." "That's right, you can't." Malcolm turned toward the nearby deputy, Officer Reynolds. A young officer, barely a year into the job, stepped forward. His eyes were wide but steady. "Escort Deputy Cargill to the break room. No communication with staff. No access to weapons. And don't let him leave this building. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Cargill's lips parted. He wanted to protest. He wanted to say something to fix it. But no words came. Only breath. Shallow, frightened breath. He didn't fight as Reynolds guided him out of the lobby. His boots scuffed across the floor. The path he took might as well have been lined with shame. Malcolm watched them go, then turned back to the people in the room. His mother, his staff, the citizens of Ridgepoint. He stood in front of the desk, the very same one where Cargill had sat just minutes before, and raised his voice with anger, but with clarity. "If anyone in this department thinks that kind of behavior is acceptable," he said, "you will not work here under my watch. I don't care what your rank is. I don't care how long you've worn that badge. If you treat the people of this town, any of them, like they're beneath you, you won't be wearing that badge another day. That ends now." A murmur swept through the room. Not disagreement, relief. Someone had finally said it. Out loud. With authority. Malcolm turned back to Evelyn, kneeling down so he was eye level. "I'm so sorry, Mama," he said. She touched his cheek gently, her fingers still damp. "I just missed you," she whispered. "That's all." He closed his eyes for a moment, let her touch sink into him. Because in all the noise, all the anger, all the unraveling of trust and power and reputation, those 5 words were the only ones that mattered. The sheriff's lobby remained tense, like the whole room was holding its breath, unsure whether it was witnessing justice unfold or the start of something far bigger. Sheriff Malcolm Carter stood beside his mother, gently patting her damp dress dry with the towel an officer had brought. Her soft white curls clung to her forehead. and her lavender dress now, heavy with water, drooped off her shoulders like a burden too large to carry. She gave him a faint smile, one he remembered from long ago when he'd scraped his knee on the church steps, and she kissed the bruise without saying a word. But this time, the smile was different. This one was tired. It was the kind of smile that tries to cover pain but can't quite do the job. An officer brought a folding chair and offered her a fresh bottle of water. It was meant as a kindness, but the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Evelyn glanced at it, then politely shook her head. "No, thank you," she said softly, her voice brittle as parchment. Malcolm didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the space with authority. Not the kind that comes from a badge or a title, but the kind that comes from pain, from restraint, from knowing exactly how close you are to exploding and choosing not to. Across the lobby, the other citizens shifted uncomfortably. Some leaned in to whisper. A few quietly texted or typed into their phones, the beginnings of viral posts already forming. Others simply stared, processing what they'd just witnessed. Some had seen officers cross lines before, but this felt different. Because today, someone with power had actually stepped in. And that was new. Officer Reynolds, the young deputy who had escorted Cargill out, returned with a pale look on his face. He nodded quickly toward Malcolm. "He's in the break room. He's not resisting, just sitting there." Malcolm nodded back. "Good. Sit down and start writing your incident report. Word for word. I want everything you saw and heard, every detail. No sugarcoating." "Yes, sir." Malcolm turned and leaned against the front desk for a moment, just long enough to exhale. His mother was sitting just a few feet behind him now, wrapped in his dry duty shirt, still visibly shaken. She looked up at him with glassy eyes but said nothing, the kind of nothing that says everything. "Sheriff Carter?" a soft voice asked from nearby. It was Officer Janine Morris. She'd served with the department for over 2 decades. Always steady, always decent. "Yes, Janine? There's already a call. Press inquiry. Someone uploaded a clip. It's spreading." Malcolm didn't sigh. He just nodded once. "Of course it is." He turned toward the civilians in the room, the ones who hadn't run. 4 of them sat still. One older man stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching like he was waiting for something. "I want to thank all of you," Malcolm said, "for staying, for witnessing. This matters, and what you saw will be part of an official investigation. If you're willing to provide a formal statement, we'll treat you with dignity, and we'll protect your voice." The veteran with the kanitha, one who'd given Evelyn his handkerchief, stepped forward again. "Sheriff, I've seen a lot in my time, and I've kept quiet more than I'm proud of. But not today. I'll speak, and I'll say it twice if I have to." Malcolm gave a short nod. "That means a lot, sir." "Thank you." A young woman holding her child raised her hand hesitantly. Will your mom be okay?" Malcolm turned, looked at Evelyn. Her eyes were closed, her breathing calm. Her hands still folded politely in her lap, but there was a tremble in her fingers. "She'll be all right," he said. "She's stronger than all of us combined." Then came the sound everyone had been expecting, but no one had dared to speak of footsteps. Steady, firm, coming fast down the hall. It was Internal Affairs. Lieutenant Diane Cole entered first, tall, sharp-featured, calm as still water. 2 investigators flanked her, one carrying a folder, the other a camera. She scanned the room with the precision of someone who'd walked into chaos 100 times before. And then she locked eyes with Malcolm. "Sheriff Carter," she said, extending a hand. "Lieutenant Cole," he replied, shaking it firmly. "Thanks for coming in fast. You said high priority. That usually means something's on fire." "It is." She tilted her head. "You sure you want us handling this? It's personal." Malcolm's expression didn't change. "Exactly why I do want you handling it." "Understood." She turned and approached Evelyn. "Ma'am," she asked gently, "would you mind if I sat with you a minute?" Evelyn opened her eyes slowly. "Are you here to fire that man?" "I'm here to make sure what happened today never happens to another woman like you again." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Then sit, please." Cole did. She spoke softly, asked only what was needed. One of her agents began photographing the puddle on the floor. Another interviewed witnesses. A fourth started reviewing the lobby's security footage. Malcolm stood back, watched it all unfold. This was what accountability looked like. Not speeches, not press releases, action. But it didn't make him feel better. Not yet. He slipped away into his office, quietly shutting the door behind him. Only then did he allow his back to lean against the wall. Only then did his breath finally hitch. His mother. His mother had been humiliated in the very lobby where he swore people would feel safe, where he'd spent months trying to rebuild trust, where he'd installed cameras, increased civilian oversight, reformed use-of-force policy, and still, it had happened. To her. He turned toward the framed photo on his bookshelf, his academy graduation. He was 24, beaming in his uniform. His mother was beside him, grinning like the world had finally caught up to what she always knew. Her son was going to change things. She was wearing that same lavender dress in the picture, the one now hanging damp in the other room. He sat behind his desk and whispered to himself, "Not here. Not again." He wasn't angry just because it was personal. He was angry because it proved something deeper. The rot wasn't at the surface. It was in the bone. And now, it had a name. And a deadline. Malcolm Carter didn't stay long in his office. He couldn't. Not while his mother was sitting just feet away, wrapped in a blanket, soaked in humiliation. Not when the cold sting of Deputy Cargill's actions still clung to the walls of the building like smoke after a fire. He stepped out into the hallway, boots hitting the tile like punctuation. No one looked up. Not the clerks behind the glass windows. Not the officers pretending to sort papers. Everyone kept their eyes down, suddenly very busy, suddenly very quiet. The same silence that had protected men like Cargill for years was now protecting itself. But it wouldn't last. In the lobby, internal affairs had taken control. Lieutenant Diane Cole moved through the room with clinical efficiency. Witnesses were seated with clipboards, statements in progress. Officers rotated in and out of the evidence room. The entire atmosphere had changed like a machine had been switched on, and now no one could afford to breathe wrong. Evelyn Carter sat off to the side, no longer in the middle of the chaos. Someone had wrapped a clean wool blanket around her shoulders. Her purse sat at her feet, waterlogged and sagging. Her hands were folded, elegant and still, and her eyes stared at the floor tiles like she was trying to remember where she was. Or maybe why. Malcolm walked to her and knelt. She didn't look at him at first. She just blinked slowly. "Mama," he said gently. Her gaze lifted. "Yes, baby? I think it's time we get you home." She nodded, voice barely audible. "Home sounds good." He helped her stand. She wobbled at first, and he tightened his grip, supporting her small frame with ease. Her arm looped through his like it belonged there. And in truth, it always had. Everyone watched. Every witness, every officer, every soul in that room stopped what they were doing to make space. It wasn't just about respect, it was something deeper. Reverence, maybe, or guilt, or both. Malcolm walked her out to the department SUV himself, opened the door, buckled her seatbelt like he had when she was recovering from knee surgery years ago, with care, with tenderness. Before he climbed in, Officer Janine Morris appeared beside the vehicle. She looked tired. She also looked furious. "I assume you want Cargill's badge?" she said. Malcolm nodded. "And his service weapon, before the day is over." "Already on it. He's crying in the break room. Still thinks he might get written up and reassigned." "He has no idea," Malcolm muttered. "I've also got Sister Lena lined up," Janine added. "Your mother knows her. Church volunteer, right?" Malcolm finally smiled, just a little. "Perfect. Send her to the house. I don't want Mama alone tonight." "You got it, Sheriff." He gave her a grateful nod, then climbed into the driver's seat. The drive home was slow. Evelyn hummed in the passenger seat, a gospel tune Malcolm hadn't heard in years. He didn't interrupt. The notes were soft and low, almost like she was humming to herself more than to him. A way to hold herself together. A way to push back the humiliation and find something familiar in the fog. When they reached the small house with the white porch rail and the rose bushes that she still insisted on tending herself, Malcolm helped her inside. Her feet shuffled against the hardwood floor. He guided her to the kitchen, warmed up some soup, and sat beside her while she ate in silence. Only when she set the spoon down did she speak. "You don't have to stay." "I know," he said, "but I want to." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes had cleared. Her voice had steadied. "You embarrassed one of your own today," she said. "In public, in front of his brothers, in front of white folks." "I did." "You sure you're ready for what comes next?" "No," he admitted. "But I'm not backing down." She nodded slowly. "That boy?" He looked at me like I wasn't real, like I was just in his way. Malcolm swallowed hard. "I've had people ignore me before," she said. "But that was different. That was hate with a badge." "I know, Mama." She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. The skin of her palm was soft, but her grip was strong. "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop now. Not for me, not for him, for all the ones who never made it out of that lobby." His throat tightened. "I won't." They sat like that, hand in hand, surrounded by the scent of chicken broth and the quiet tick of the clock on the wall. When Sister Lena arrived, Evelyn smiled. It was small, but real. The two women embraced like old friends, and Malcolm felt the tension in his chest loosen just enough to breathe. He stepped out onto the porch as the sun began to set. The sky was streaked with orange and pink. It should have been a peaceful evening, but peace wasn't something Malcolm felt anymore. Back at the department, Lieutenant Cole's team had begun reviewing the camera footage. She didn't call Malcolm in. She didn't have to. But he came anyway. He stood in the doorway of the viewing room, watched the screen. He only watched the footage once. That was all he needed. He saw Cargill's face twist in anger. He saw his mother flinch when the water hit her. He saw her shrink under the weight of that moment, not just in body, but in soul. And he felt something inside himself shift. Something final. He didn't just see a policy violation. He saw a promise broken. A sacred promise to protect the vulnerable. To never let the badge become a weapon. And now, it was personal. Because the woman in that chair wasn't just a civilian, she was his mother. And she represented every black mother who ever waited quietly at the front desk, hoping someone would treat her son with decency. That night, Malcolm sat in his office long after the station emptied out, and he wrote one sentence across a blank legal pad. "This ends now." The next morning, Ridgepoint felt different. It wasn't the weather. The sky still wore its usual curtain of pale gray, and the air was as sticky as ever, heavy with humidity and the scent of fresh-cut grass. Cars rolled down Main Street. The diner still opened at 6 sharp, and someone somewhere was still complaining about their neighbor's fence. On the surface, everything was the same. But something had shifted. The tension in the air was thicker than usual. People looked at each other longer. Some offered awkward smiles. Others, quick glances that turned away too fast. A storm had passed and left behind more than puddles. By the time Sheriff Malcolm Carter stepped through the front doors of the department, the video had already passed 250,000 views. The image of his mother, soaked and trembling, had circulated faster than any press conference ever could. Local reporters had parked across the street, their cameras idle but ready. One held a mic in his hand like a match waiting to be struck. But Malcolm didn't even glance in their direction. He walked into the building like a man on a mission. Because he was. Inside, the department was unusually quiet. No morning chatter, no clattering mugs. Officers and clerks alike straightened in their seats when he passed. Some nodded, some didn't, but all of them watched him walk past the front desk where it happened, watched him disappear into his office without a single word. 10 minutes later, he called for a full staff assembly. The department's briefing room filled quickly. No one dared be late. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because they were told. And a few came because they needed to know. What now? Malcolm didn't start speaking right away. He stood behind the podium, eyes scanning the room, jaw firm. He let the silence do the heavy lifting. And then, he began. "Yesterday, something happened in this building that never should have happened anywhere." His voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It cut. An elderly woman walked through those front doors, looking for help. She was confused. She was vulnerable. And instead of finding compassion, she was mocked. She was yelled at. And then she was assaulted. There was no reaction, just stillness. "That woman wasn't just my mother," Malcolm continued. "She was a citizen of this town. She was a person. And what was done to her wasn't an accident. It was a choice." Some officers shifted in their seats. There are people in this room who believe loyalty means silence, that brotherhood means covering for each other no matter what, that the badge on your chest gives you permission to dehumanize anyone you don't respect. But let me be clear about something. He stepped away from the podium. Those days are over. The room stayed quiet, but the silence was different now. It wasn't just awkward, it was heavy. Real. "I didn't take this job to make friends. I took it because I believed we could do better. And I still believe that. But make no mistake, if we have to tear this culture down to its bones to rebuild it, we will." From the back, a voice broke in. "Are we really going to fire him over this?" It was Deputy Paul Laird. 10 years on the job, known for speaking his mind. Malcolm turned slowly. "You want to say that louder, Deputy?" Laird shrugged. "Look, I'm just saying she wandered into the back hallway. She didn't check in. He didn't know who she was. Maybe he overreacted, but—" Termination? Doesn't that seem harsh? Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "You're right. He didn't know who she was. But that's the point. He didn't know. And still, he thought it was okay to treat her like she didn't matter." He took a step forward. If she had been white, in designer clothes, carrying a briefcase instead of a worn-out handbag, do you think he would have done the same thing? Laird didn't respond. "This isn't just about one man," Malcolm continued. "It's about every moment someone in this building thought cruelty was policy. It's about the quiet approval we give by saying nothing, and that ends now." He pointed to the department's code of ethics displayed on the wall. "Honor, duty, respect, integrity. Those aren't decorations. Those are promises. If you can't live by them, then take off the badge now. Don't wait for me to come and take it from you." At first, the room was silent again. And then someone clapped. Just one, then another, then a few more. It wasn't an ovation. It wasn't a celebration. It was a signal. Something had cracked, a barrier that had held back accountability, honesty, and progress split right down the middle. And through that crack, something honest was finally coming through. After the meeting, Malcolm returned to his office. Within the hour, 2 deputies had scheduled private appointments with HR. By the end of the day, there would be 4. Malcolm didn't expect them all to come clean, but he knew what those meetings meant. They were a message. The old system had been put on notice. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Cole entered his office with a folder. "We've reviewed the footage. There's no question," she said. "Gross misconduct, unprovoked aggression, misdemeanor assault. We recommend immediate suspension pending final review." Malcolm signed the papers without a word. Then he drafted a statement for the press. He didn't run it through PR. He didn't rehearse it. He walked out onto the steps of the sheriff's department, where the reporters were waiting like vultures. Microphones extended. Cameras rolled. He stepped to the edge of the steps and looked straight into the lens. "Yesterday," he began, "something disgraceful happened inside this building. I'm not here to deny it. I'm not here to spin it. I'm here to say, we own it, and we change it." He took a breath. "This department will not be a place where disrespect hides behind a badge. Not on my watch." He didn't take questions. He didn't need to, because the message had already been received, and this time no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. The following days in Ridgepoint felt like something was unraveling and rebuilding at the same time. For the first time in years, conversations that had always been whispered behind closed doors were now happening out in the open. At the diner, in barber shops, in church halls, and grocery lines, people were talking. Not just about the incident, but about what it meant. They talked about what happened to Evelyn Carter, about the way Deputy Cargill had acted, and most of all, about the way her son Sheriff Malcolm Carter had responded. Some called him brave. Others said he'd embarrassed the department. There were whispers that he'd made it personal, and grumbles that he'd gone too far. But whether people liked it or not, they all understood something had shifted. and no one could ignore it anymore. Inside the sheriff's department, the tension hadn't left. If anything, it had grown sharper, like walking barefoot across glass. The break room stayed quieter than usual. Officers no longer chatted freely during shift changes. People were watching their words, watching each other, watching themselves. Lieutenant Diane Cole's internal affairs investigation moved quickly. Her team didn't rest. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Every camera angle was reviewed frame by frame. And on the 5th day, she placed the full report on Malcolm's desk. It was worse than expected. Not just because of what Cargill had done, but because of what had been ignored for so long. 3 prior complaints had been filed against Cargill within the last 2 years, all from black residents, all alleging aggressive behavior, raised voices, disrespect. One involved a traffic stop with an elderly Army veteran who said Cargill told him, "You people always think someone owes you something." None of those complaints had been escalated. One had been closed for insufficient evidence. Another had been dismissed when the complainant failed to call back. The third never even made it to the review board. The trail of neglect was damning. Malcolm didn't say a word. He just stared at the report for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the town. The streets of Ridgepoint looked so ordinary from above. Neat sidewalks, familiar intersections. It was the same town where he'd learned to ride a bike. The same one where his father had worked at the mill. The same town that had voted him sheriff. But now, it felt different. Or maybe it always had been. When he turned around, he spoke in a low, even voice. "I want a full audit." Cole blinked. "Of what?" "All complaints," he said. "Internal reports, reviews, disciplinary actions. Go back 10 years. She raised an eyebrow. "That's going to rattle a lot of cages." "I'm counting on it," he said. "Any limits?" "Numbers start with Cargill. But if it leads higher, keep going. I don't care who it touches." No more shadows. Cole gave a single nod. Understood. It didn't take long for word of the audit to get out. By the next morning, 5 officers had requested early retirement. 2 filed for transfers out of Ridgepoint. And 1 old sergeant turned in a 1-sentence resignation. "I won't be part of this circus." Malcolm read it, folded the letter once, and slid it into a folder without comment. He didn't have to say anything. The actions were speaking louder than any press release ever could. But change doesn't come easy. And it never comes without resistance. At a town council meeting later that week, things finally boiled over. The meeting hall was packed. Journalists, residents, officers in uniform standing along the back wall. The whole town was watching now. A few council members solder, sharp-jawed men in tailored suits voiced their disapproval. "We support accountability, Sheriff," one of them began. "But what you're doing here feels more like a purge." Malcolm stood at the podium, unmoving. "It's an audit," he said calmly. "Not a purge. If folks have done nothing wrong, they have nothing to worry about." Another leaned forward, hands clasped. "Be that as it may, this kind of scandal? It could shake the public's trust in law enforcement." Malcolm raised his eyebrows. "Shake it?" He took a slow breath. "My mother walked into a sheriff's office. The one building that's supposed to protect Herond was humiliated, insulted, and soaked to the bone by a man with a badge. The trust wasn't shaken. It was shattered. The room went still. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. This isn't about image," he continued. "It's about integrity. And if that makes people uncomfortable, they should ask themselves why." Later that night, Malcolm sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet again. The kind of quiet that made a man think. He looked across the room at a photograph of himself as a child, sitting on his mother's lap at a church picnic. Her smile in the photo was wide, proud, free. Not like the one she'd forced the day he took her home in a blanket. He remembered something she used to say to him. "If you ever want to change the world, baby, be ready to bleed for it." At the time, he thought she meant sacrifice. Now he understood. She meant the ache. The kind that builds in your chest and doesn't go away when the cameras turn off. The kind that comes from knowing you're trying to fix something that didn't break overnight and won't heal overnight either. A knock broke the silence. It was Officer Janine Morris. She looked like she'd been debating whether to say something. "You got a second?" Malcolm nodded. Yeah. She stepped in and sat down across from him. Cargill wants to talk, she said. He didn't react. He's still on leave, she added. But he asked if you'd be willing to meet him. Off the record. Said it's important. Malcolm stared at her, then leaned back in his chair. Did he say why? Number just said he had something you needed to hear. He didn't answer right away. He tapped a pen against his desk. Thought about it. Then nodded slowly. Set it up, tomorrow, conference room, no press, no cameras, just the two of us. Janine hesitated. You sure that's a good idea? No, Malcolm said. But it might be a necessary one, because justice doesn't end with discipline. Sometimes it begins with a conversation, even if it's one you don't want to have. The next morning, the conference room felt colder than usual. Sheriff Malcolm Carter sat alone at the long oak table, waiting. No notepad in front of him, no folder, no distractions, just folded hands and a silence thick enough to hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights above. The blinds were drawn. The hallway behind the glass door was quiet. This wasn't a public meeting. This wasn't about protocol. This was personal. At precisely 9 a.m., the door creaked open. Deputy Brian Cargill stepped in slowly. He didn't wear a uniform. Just a wrinkled polo shirt and khakis that hadn't seen an iron in days. No badge, no radio, no swagger. His hair was uncombed, his eyes ringed with red. He looked smaller than Malcolm remembered, shrunk by shame, by exhaustion, or maybe both. He closed the door and took a seat across from the sheriff. No one else was in the room. For a long time, neither man spoke. Cargill broke the silence first. I'm not here to beg, he said. Good, Malcolm replied, because that wouldn't change anything. Cargill nodded, eyes still fixed on the table. I figured. I just needed to say some things. Not for your forgiveness. I know that's not coming. Malcolm leaned back, arms folded. Then talk. Cargill licked his lips and took a deep breath. I've been a cop for 18 years, most of it here in Ridgepoint, and I really thought I was doing it right. Holding the line, protecting the peace. You know, Malcolm's expression didn't change. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. Not all people, just certain ones. He hesitated. Black folks, mostly. Elderly people. Poor folks who didn't know the law well enough to push back. I'd never say it out loud. I didn't even admit it to myself. But I started acting like they mattered. Malcolm's stare hardened. You know what's worse than a man who acts like that? He asked. A man who doesn't even realize he's doing it. Cargill nodded, swallowing hard. That's what scares me now. Because I didn't wake up one day and say, I'm gonna become the problem. But I did. I became exactly the kind of cop I used to hate. You didn't just become the problem, Cargill, Malcolm said, his voice low and steady. You made my mother afraid to walk into a place where her son is the sheriff. Cargill looked up. I didn't know it was her. And if it had been someone else's mother, Malcolm asked, would you still have done it? Cargill looked away. I don't know. Then you just answered my question. Cargill shifted in his chair. After it happened, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face. Not because she looked scared, but because she looked like she'd seen it all before. Like I wasn't the first. Just another in a long, tired line. Malcolm sat still, listening. And when you came out of that hallway, Cargill added, I thought I was about to lose my job. But what hit me harder was the look on your face. You weren't just angry. You looked broken. Like I'd done something to the only thing in your world that mattered. You did. I believe you, Cargill said quietly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. Malcolm looked down. What's this? A list of things I saw, things I was part of, things I covered up. I started writing it all down the night I saw your mother in that chair. Malcolm unfolded it. The names, dates, descriptions, incidents swept under the rug, officers who got warnings instead of write-ups, victims who walked away because they were tired of not being believed. Why now? Cargill sat back. Because I don't want to take this to my grave. And if I have any shot of making peace with what I've done, it starts here. With you. With this. Malcolm stared at him for a long time. You think this makes things right? No, Cargill replied. But maybe it makes them a little less wrong. Malcolm folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket. I'll have internal affairs verify every word. Good, Cargill said. They should. I'm not going to thank you. I wouldn't want you to. I'm not going to shake your hand. You shouldn't. Malcolm stood. You may never wear a badge again. I know, and you're going to have to live with what you did. I already am. As Malcolm turned to leave, he stopped at the door. Without looking back, he said, You should be grateful my mother doesn't remember everything. Cargill blinked. What do you mean? Because if she did, Malcolm said, she'd forgive you. That's the kind of woman she is. But I won't. I can't. And this town shouldn't either. Then he left the room. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. Ridgepoint streets were already warming under the morning light. But Malcolm didn't feel warmth. Not yet. What he felt was resolve. He walked straight to Lieutenant Cole's office and handed her the folded list. Start at the top, he said. Quietly. Confirm every incident, every name. Reopen what needs to be reopened. I want progress reports daily. She looked at the list, then at him. You really think there's this much dirt under the rug? I don't think, he replied. I know. As she got to work, Malcolm returned to his office and closed the door behind him. The air was still, the silence loud. He sat down, reached for a new legal pad, and wrote across the top in bold letters, Systemic reform, no exceptions, no excuses, because what had started with one act of cruelty had exposed something much bigger. This wasn't just about holding a bad cop accountable. This was about taking apart a system that protected him. And for Malcolm, that fight had only just begun. The day Malcolm handed that folded list to Lieutenant Cole, everything started moving faster than he anticipated. Her team didn't waste a second. They began cross-referencing names, timestamps, old incident reports, footage logs, even dusty filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. What they found wasn't just negligence, it was intentional omission. Complaints dating back 8, even 10 years had been buried under vague language phrases like officer discretion, community misunderstanding, or the most damning of all, no further action necessary. It was a language designed to look official, but mean nothing. To shut the door quietly on pain without leaving fingerprints. And then there were the names. One stood out. A retired patrol sergeant, now enjoying early pension, had racked up 4 separate complaints from residents in a predominantly black neighborhood. Aggressive traffic stops, verbal abuse, property damage. Every single complaint dismissed before reaching internal review. When Malcolm saw that, he sat at his desk for over 3 hours, pen in hand, circling timelines, drawing arrows across dates, scribbling questions in the margins like he was decoding a criminal conspiracy, because that's what it had become. Not a few bad apples, not even just a broken system. It was a conspiracy of silence, and it had lived under his roof longer than he had. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, How many did we fail? The answer came in the quiet. Too many. The next morning, he called a closed-door meeting with the district attorney. They sat across from each other in a back room lined with case files and city maps. The DA was a careful man, mid-60s, polished, always aware of cameras even when there weren't any. He reviewed the report with slow, deliberate page turns. When he finished, he took off his glasses, placed them on the folder, and said, This is going to be a disaster. Malcolm didn't flinch. This is justice. Sheriff, the DA sighed. You start reopening these cases, you're going to make enemies. Loud ones, powerful ones. Some of them still have friends on the council. I'm not worried about making friends. The DA studied him. And what if this blows up in your face? Malcolm leaned forward. Then it means I finally hit something worth breaking. By the end of the meeting, they had a framework. Cases tied to flagged officers would be reviewed, one by one. Statutes of limitations wouldn't protect patterns of abuse. Whistleblowers would be offered protection, and most importantly, victims would be contacted. Some would want answers. Some would just want to know they'd finally been believed. Malcolm left the building that day with the weight of it pressing on his shoulders. He knew what was coming. More resignations, angry editorials, maybe even threats. But he also knew something else. There was no going back. A few nights later, Malcolm hosted a community forum at the Ridgepoint Public Library. The entire event room was packed, standing room only. Families, teachers, students, retirees, former complainants, off-duty officers. Some wore T-shirts that read "Evelyn's Voice." Others clutched handwritten signs, "Accountability Now," and "We Believe Her." There were people in the crowd who hadn't stepped foot in a town meeting in years, maybe decades. And there was Malcolm standing at the front of the room without a podium, without a script, just a mic in one hand and the weight of an entire department on his shoulders. He started by talking about the audit, the results, the patterns, the reality. He explained that there would be case reopenings, internal disciplinary hearings, even criminal referrals. He told them how his mother had walked into a building looking for her son and walked out carrying the burden of decades of silence. And then came the question that changed the room. An older woman in the back, gray hair, wrapped in a red scarf, stood up slowly. "Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "how do we know this won't just fade like it always does? A few headlines, some meetings, then quiet, then nothing." Malcolm didn't dodge it. He walked to the edge of the stage and looked directly at her. "Because I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Because I see it now and I can't unsee it. Because my mother may forget that day. But I won't. Not ever. Because this time, the door's open, and sunlight's pouring in. And I promise you, no one's closing it without going through me first." The room erupted in applause, loud, raw, real, but not everyone clapped. At the back wall stood 3 uniformed deputies, arms crossed, faces blank, not defiant, not supportive, just watching. Malcolm saw them. He didn't call them out. He didn't need to, because he understood something that still made them uncomfortable. You don't fix a foundation by asking permission. You rip out every rotten beam, and you rebuild it brick by brick with your bare hands if you have to. Later that night, back in his office, Malcolm sat alone. Again, the building was nearly empty, but his mind wasn't potted bay. It was racing, flashing through every victim he'd read about, every report he'd underlined, every officer he suspected but didn't yet have proof against. And then he opened a drawer, pulled out an old envelope. Inside was a letter from his first week as sheriff. It had come from a woman whose son had been arrested years ago under suspicious circumstances. She'd written, "I don't expect anything to change, but maybe you'll be the first who doesn't forget." At the time, he didn't respond. Tonight, he wrote her back. "Ma'am," he began, "I'm sorry I didn't respond sooner. I didn't forget. I just didn't know how deep it went. Now I do, and I'm not looking away." He sealed the envelope, placed it on the edge of his desk, and turned out the light. Because tonight, for the first time in years, he believed his department might finally be moving in the right direction. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. The hearing room was filled, but no one made a sound. At the long table in front sat the disciplinary board, 3 senior officers, 2 civilian representatives, and 1 legal advisor from the state. Sheriff Malcolm Carter stood at the side wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. This wasn't a celebration. This wasn't about winning. It was about drawing the line. Deputy Brian Cargill sat opposite the board. He wore a suit this time, not a uniform. There was no badge pinned to his chest, no air of authority left in his posture. He looked smaller than the man who had once barked orders in the Ridgepoint lobby. Smaller than the man who had poured cold water on a 79-year-old woman. He had submitted a written statement of apology. He had also submitted a request for a disciplinary review rather than termination. It didn't matter. After 30 minutes of deliberation, the board returned with their ruling. Effective immediately, Deputy Brian Cargill would be permanently terminated from the Ridgepoint Sheriff's Department. Furthermore, his certification for law enforcement in the state would be revoked indefinitely. He would be barred from applying for any law enforcement position in the state of Georgia ever again. There was no applause, just a heavy, collective exhale. A silent recognition that justice, however, late had arrived. Malcolm didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the room. This wasn't about revenge. It was about resolution. That afternoon, he drove to his mother's house on the quiet side of town. The porch railing had been recently painted. The roses were in full bloom, crimson and pink, stretching toward the sun like they were singing. Evelyn Carter was sitting on the porch swing, knitting quietly, the same lavender blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hands moved slowly, rhythmically, like she was threading peace back into the world one loop at a time. She didn't remember every detail of that day in the lobby. Not anymore. But she remembered the voice of her son. She remembered the look on his face. She remembered that he had promised to do something, and he had. When she saw him approach, her eyes lit up. "You look tired, baby," she said. "I am," Malcolm replied, letting out a slow breath as he sat beside her. They didn't speak for a while. They just sat, side by side, the old porch creaking beneath them, watching the wind roll through the trees and scatter petals across the yard. It was the first real quiet he'd had in weeks. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "You did what you were supposed to do." Malcolm didn't reply. He just reached over and took her hand, weathered and warm, and held it like he was anchoring himself to something eternal. The next morning, the town hall was packed. Not because of scandal, not because of protest, because of policy. Malcolm stood at the front of the room with a slideshow behind him. No politics, no drama, just facts. A presentation of the department's newly enacted reforms, mandatory body camera usage for all officers, with weekly audits, monthly civilian oversight board meetings open to the public, a complaint system that now included third-party monitoring, and a guaranteed response within 10 business days. Bias training, not just as a formality, but as a quarterly requirement. And most importantly, a mandatory annual review of all use-of-force incidents, with automatic flagging of repeated names. It was met with cautious applause. Some faces looked skeptical. Others leaned in with curiosity. But there was something else in the room, too. Hope. Tentative, fragile, but real. After the meeting, as people filtered out, a boy no older than 12 approached Malcolm with his grandmother. He was shy, shoulders hunched, gripping a notebook. "Are you the real sheriff?" the boy asked. Malcolm knelt down to his level and smiled. "Last time I checked." The boy hesitated. "Does this mean the police will be nice now?" Malcolm paused, then said, "It means they'll be better, and if they're not, you come find me." The boy nodded hard. His grandmother gave Malcolm a look that said more than words ever could. A week later, the Ridgepoint Gazette ran a front-page headline, "A new standard in Ridgepoint," but Malcolm never read it. He didn't have time. There were roll calls to attend, night shifts to drop in on, new hires to personally interview, not to micromanage but to make a statement. Accountability wasn't a phase. It was a foundation. He made unannounced stops at precinct counters. He asked dispatchers what they needed. He showed up at training sessions, not to test, just to listen. And slowly, something changed. Officers who used to roll their eyes now took notes. Citizens who used to avoid the front entrance now walked in with questions. Complaints came in faster, but they were being processed faster, too. Trust hadn't been restored, but it had begun. And Evelyn Carter? She watered her roses every morning like she always had. Sometimes she forgot where her keys were. Sometimes she called Malcolm Ray by mistake her late husband's name, but she always smiled when she saw her son's car pull into the driveway. One afternoon, as Malcolm climbed the station steps, he saw a teenage girl sitting outside with a backpack and a notebook. She stood when she saw him. "Excuse me, Sheriff," she said. "I'm writing a story for school." "What kind of story?" "It's called What Justice Looks Like," she said shyly. "Can I ask you a few questions?" Malcolm chuckled softly. "Sure, but I'm not sure I have all the answers." "That's okay," she replied. "I just want to know how it starts." He thought for a second, then said, "It starts small, it starts steady, and it starts when someone refuses to look away." She smiled and started writing. Malcolm held the door open for her, because that's how the story ends. Not with fireworks, not with headlines, but with doors left open, with promises kept, with a man who understood that justice isn't loud, it's patient, it's persist, and it always starts at home. In a world where so many stories fade with the news cycle, this one lingers because it speaks to something deeper than policy or punishment. It's about dignity. It's about the quiet strength of a mother whose love became a turning point for a whole town. And it's about a son who didn't just wear a badge, it carried a promise. This story reminds us that justice doesn't always come with a spotlight. Sometimes it comes in silence, in doing the right thing when no one's watching, in holding the linen knot with power but with principle. It's a message especially meaningful for older generations who've seen the slow arc of change. You know that real reform isn't fast, it's not easy, but it's worth fighting for. Whether you're a parent, a veteran, a neighbor, or someone who's lived long enough to know the cost of silence, this story is for you. Because it shows that one voice, one moment, one act of courage really can matter. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through, or something we all still need to face together, then take a moment, hit like, share it with someone you care about. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life stories that honor the values we carry forward: respect, accountability, and humanity. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we are and who we're still becoming.